Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Santo, and I'm a senior program coordinator with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Food Policy Networks Project. Also on the call with us is Karen Bassarab, a senior program officer, and Ann Palmer, a program director at the center. This webinar, which is titled The Role of Cities, Equitable Food Systems, and Healthy Food Access in and Out of Crises, is being co-hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Common Market. The Center for a Livable Future is an interdisciplinary academic center based within the Bloomberg School of Public Health's Department of Environmental Health and Engineering. We work towards building a healthier, more equitable, and resilient food system. The Food Policy Networks Project is one of our projects, with the goal of building the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do that through training, sharing good practices, and networking with other food policy councils and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you're not familiar with us, I encourage you to check out our website, foodpolicynetworks.org, and to sign up for our listserv to hear about future webinars. For this webinar, we're thrilled to partner with the Common Market to bring together this amazing group of food policy directors and city leaders to reflect on their food access programs and their city's COVID-19 responses. We expect today to be an engaging, forward-thinking conversation that hopefully opens the doors for more collaboration and sharing of good practices moving forward. Next slide. The Common Market has been an integral partner in fresh, healthy food access throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Their ability to support municipalities across US geographies in addressing food insecurity is in part what brings together today's panelists. Their Farm Fresh Box program, which includes the distribution of individualized boxes of regionally sourced fruits and vegetables, proves to be a safe food access solution for cities, schools, communities, and more. Today, they continue to offer these boxes of nourishment to partners, which in turn provide meaningful support to the local farming community. The Common Market in its day-to-day serves as a nonprofit aggregator and distributor of food produced by local family farms. Their operations lift up and rely on short value chains, direct distribution, and close relationships between farmers and the people they feed. Next slide. The nonprofit recently published a case study highlighting their partnerships with city government agencies of Atlanta, Georgia, Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City, New York, that explores how their Farm Fresh Box program helped meet the emergent food access needs of their communities during the COVID-19 pandemic and helped impact the local economy in the process. At the helm of these city food access initiatives are today's panelists. Luisa Cardona serves as the Deputy Director for the City of Atlanta's Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, Welcoming Atlanta, where she provides citywide policy and programmatic support for the integration and inclusion of migrant and marginalized communities. During her time at the Mayor's Office, Luisa launched the city's first citizenship program and created and implemented a citywide language access policy. Prior to joining the Mayor's Office, Luisa served the immigrant community as an attorney, both in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C. Luisa is a naturalized US citizen and a proud Colombian American. Holly Freistadt is Baltimore City's first food policy director and is the chief of food policy and planning division in the Department of Planning. She created and oversees the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative with the goal to address food system policy and to build an equitable and resilient urban food system. Holly received the 2016 Medallion for Meritorious Service Award by the former mayor, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, and was honored as one of Maryland's Daily Record's top 100 women in Maryland. The Baltimore Food Policy Initiative was also recognized internationally with the highest award for the implementation of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact in 2016. And Kate McKenzie is the Executive Director of New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, where she advises the mayor on all issues related to food policy and the city's food system. She leads the interagency COVID-19 food response to ensure that no New Yorker experiences hunger as a result of the pandemic. Kate also leads the city's good food purchasing commitments, focused on increasing access to healthy, sustainable foods for the over 238 million meals and snacks served daily by city agencies. She released Food Forward New York City, the city's comprehensive policy framework to reach a more equitable, sustainable, and healthy food system by 2031. Kate comes to the mayor's office from nearly 2 decades in nonprofit and academia. And we're pleased that they made time today to share their experiences with us. Before we begin, we'll also briefly review the logistics of the webinar. Rachel Terry will present an overview of the Common Market's Farm Fresh Box program and how that supported cities' COVID-19 responses. Rachel will then moderate a discussion with the panelists with questions generated in advance of the webinar. For the last 10 minutes, we will open it up for Q&A. All attendees are muted. If you have a question or comment at any point throughout the webinar, please submit your question in the Q&A box located on the floating toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat box to communicate to other attendees and keep the questions in the Q&A box. For those attending by phone, you can hit *9 if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, and *6 to unmute when we call on you. We will be recording today's webinar, and we will share it with everyone that registered in the next few days. At this point, I'll pass it off to Rachel Terry. Rachel serves as the Common Market's National Partnerships Director. In this role, she builds relationships with food policy leaders, food service teams, community members, and food justice advocates to create access and build capacity for local food procurement. In response to COVID-19, she served a critical role behind the scenes, facilitating procurement, logistics, and operations for emergency food relief partnerships. Now, without further ado, we hand it off to you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Terry, and I am so excited to be here with all of you today. We're here to celebrate and to lift up the tremendous and innovative work that was accomplished in partnership with diverse communities over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. We do recognize that this panel itself does not represent the level of diversity reflected by these citywide efforts, and we do hope to bring to this discussion the energy, commitment, and perspective of those stakeholders. The Common Market wants to start off by thanking our hosting partners, the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Futures Food Policy Networks Project, for helping us to lift up these stories today. We're bringing this panel together for a few reasons. First, we want to applaud the amazing efforts that were catalyzed by these city leaders and their teams. We want to illustrate and reimagine what food access programming can look like during a time of crisis. And then we wanted to create space to think about the future of food access and the connection to equitable food systems in our cities and our communities. And so with that, hello panelists. We are so excited to dive into this discussion with you today. And speaking on behalf of the Common Market and our network of family farmers, it has been such an honor to work with each of you and your cities over the past year and a half. I wanted to begin by grounding this conversation in a few points of impact, in the data that helped shape the story about what these cities were able to achieve in the midst of crisis. Collectively, between March 2020, as we know, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and early spring of this year, this group was responsible for distributing over 2.8 million meal equivalents, each of which was made up of high quality, nutritious fruits, vegetables, and more, all sourced from local and sustainable family farms, reaching almost 290,000 individuals and families, primarily comprised of socially disadvantaged, vulnerable populations, including immigrants, undocumented, and those unable or unwilling to leave their home due to the threats posed by the pandemic. Supporting nearly 60 family farmers and producers, many of whom had lost their traditional wholesale outlets, and putting over $4.3 million into the hands of those hardworking supply chain partners. So these numbers are real. They impact families, farmers, supply chains, and livelihoods. And what is not captured in those numbers, but was also so clear from each of these cities' efforts, was the way that recipients felt when the emergency response prioritized fresh and wholesome foods. I lift up this quote here from Janice, who was a recipient of our New York City pantry box. And I remember when this email came through, it was at a time when our team was so tired and exhausted and working so hard to figure out the coordination and the logistics of this response. And this note came in, and I feel like all of us just took a moment to pause and to breathe and cry and recognize like what impact this effort really had and how it was rooted in dignity, in normalcy. And you see what she says, that she opens up this box and her first thought was that someone wanted her to live. And so that is what grounds this conversation today. But we also want to talk about where we go from here and what we learned in the past year and a half that can inform a more restorative path forward. So with that, we're going to dive in to some questions. And I'd love to kick things off by honoring each of your city's responses to COVID-19. As we know, local governments, food policy departments, and your coordinating agencies were faced with an enormous challenge and responsibility. So Kate, my first question is for you. The city of New York, where I am also personally based, represented at the earliest stages the epicenter of COVID-19. And you face an unprecedented challenge, keeping 8.2 million residents fed during a global health crisis. So how would you summarize the city's initial approach to food access? What were your priorities and how did you make this all happen?
Sure. Thank you for that question, and to my colleagues and all the people who are making the time out of their Friday in August to listen to this. And thanks for sharing that quote. I really needed to be reminded of that, especially on a day like this. So, from the get-go back, around March 13th of 2020 or so, when it became quite clear what we were facing with an imminent pause order, Mayor de Blasio really laid down the commitment that no New Yorker should experience hunger as a result of COVID. And so with that, we put together the fact that our taxis were no longer going to be driving around the city in the way that everyone knows them, and put them to use by literally providing meals delivered to home for any New Yorker that needed it. Really no questions asked. We wanted to make sure that anyone who was in need of food, could not afford private delivery service, and had no one to get food for them, could obtain those meals. That occurred by either calling 311, registering for those meals online, or as the months went on, we enlisted nonprofit providers to help enroll people into the program. We put together, as many people may remember, a Food Czar team, and I think I've got at least one representative from the Department of Sanitation on the call, who stood up at, I think, the height, more than 40 contracts to vendors all across the city, and certainly Common Market is one of them. In addition to that, that provision of more than 225 million meals through that program, all of our schools were able to quickly pivot to serving as grab-and-go sites. And we are one of, I believe, the only city that enabled adults to also utilize that program. So adults could be served at schools as well with meals as they needed them. We also just coordinated amongst our really robust food pantry network across the city with both food and funds to direct meals to where they were needed most. And I think in particular, we really tried to have a very strong commitment that continues around communication with both electeds, advocates, and stakeholders. And that was a two-directional communication. So again, just on the underlying premise that no New Yorker should experience hunger as a result of COVID, we stood up those programs at the center, and then a number of wraparound services as well.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Holly, I'll pass it off to you. We'd love to hear what shaped your food access programming at the City of Baltimore.
Hello, everyone. So for Baltimore City, because we already had an existing food policy and planning division, we already had an interagency collaboration, an emergency plan in place, our Food Policy Action Coalition, and our resident equity advisors. We were really able to mobilize and maximize everybody and anyone in the creation and implementation of our response. And another key factor is prior to COVID-19, we already were doing extensive food environment mapping. We had our healthy food priority area maps and briefs. And so we already had a baseline of data. And so we were understanding very quickly, like overnight, our healthy food priority area data, which other people call food deserts, was out of date overnight because unemployment was so high that that data was irrelevant. And so we were quickly able to get the SNAP data and then use other data sources as well, understanding that all residents who need to be on SNAP can be on SNAP, to help dictate and guide where our response needs to go. So we started to map monthly where SNAP is and look at our resources and other data sources. So understanding those kind of conditions before and during COVID we were able to have a 4-point strategy. First is really to leverage and expand the federal meals. And so the numbers I'm going to give you right now are a 1-year data set, just because that's our report that just came out, but we're still doing all our operations to date. But we were able to do 13.6 million meals for older adults and youth. And also similar to Kate, we did provide meals to all adults as well, not just kids at the schools. We've also produced and distributed over 1 million food boxes to date. That's produce and shelf-stable boxes. We did protect and maximize federal nutrition benefits, but one of the innovations there, not just with SNAP and online SNAP and those pieces, is we did a $6 million direct cash assistance, $400 per household for those who are not benefiting from traditional federal nutrition assistance. And the last part of our strategy was build food system resilience through urban agriculture. And the main goal there is that we were able to get $1 million in community food grants, but also lift up and support farms throughout the entire response. So high level, that was our 4-point strategy. And in future questions, I'll talk a little bit more in detail. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Hallie. And Louisa, I'll pass it to you. Can you speak a little bit about your work at Welcoming Atlanta?
Yes, of course. First, I want to acknowledge our former director, Michelle Masher, because without her, this program would have never launched. She had really the strategy and the vision which made this happen. And I would say our program is a little unique than the other 2 cities because we are an Office of Immigrant Affairs. Let me say, we have an amazing Office of Sustainability. We have an amazing Director of Food Sustainability, but we continue to work with a very niche population. We work with immigrant and limited English proficient individuals in the city of Atlanta. So why in the world were we involved in food, right? And food distribution? And I would say, well, that was shaped by the pandemic. When the pandemic started, we started receiving hundreds of calls from our constituency about their food insecurity. A lot of them worked in the service industry, in the food industry, were cash employees, were fearful of or did not have access to unemployment or other federal benefits. And so they were really just in this gap. And when we tried to reach service providers, Atlanta has tended to be historically a very Black and white city. So the service providers locally were used to serving traditional communities. And when we asked them to serve limited English proficient or individuals from immigrant communities that might have different cultural needs, there was a big gap. And so we saw ourselves in this place where we needed to fill that gap in an emergency situation. Luckily, we found Common Market to be a partner in helping us fill that gap because we certainly couldn't have done it alone. But really, our program was primarily shaped by the need of the community and the fact that our ecosystem wasn't where it needed to be in terms of food sustainability to serve immigrant communities, which had different needs. Another thing that primarily shaped our program is that we wanted to serve people with dignity. And that meant in a very difficult and undignified time for a lot of communities that weren't used to asking for help. And so a way that we sought to overcome that and to also overcome the trust barrier, because a lot of immigrant communities were fearful of even approaching or asking, is we made our program be powered by the very communities we served. So we hired from those same immigrant communities to help with food distributions, to promote the program, to tell their neighbors about the program. So it was a community-led effort versus a government actor or a partner who they never seen before coming in and saying, hey, here's some food, this is what you're gonna get. Really, the program was largely shaped by the community. They're the ones who told us the foods that they wanted, what they wanted to see, and fresh and local produce was a big part of that, which is why we were very lucky to have Common Market be in that. And there's more, but as Holly said, we can get that into that later on.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing. I know we were a part of all of those efforts, but hearing it reflected back, it's just so inspiring what each of you were able in partnership with your cities and communities to accomplish. So thank you. I want to shift now to the supply chain and the farm side impact. So as we know, COVID-19 also had a tremendous impact on our food system and its growers. As institutions and traditional retailers shut their doors, market access for many farms was also stifled. And I have a quote here from one of our producers, Steve Fracon of Fracon Fruit Farms, who's based in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. And he quotes that our partnership with the Common Market and their city contracts have been a lifeline for our farm during the crisis. They helped keep our farm viable, kept employees working while millions of Americans were unemployed, and distributed our fruit to those in need. This is why we farm. So Holly, I'm going to kick this question over to you. The City of Baltimore's food access solutions not only offered a safety net for residents, but also for farmers. What were some of the considerations that you all at the City of Baltimore took into account in ensuring that your contracts were also supporting and lifting up the viability of local and regional growers? And how important was that to you all in structuring these emergency efforts?
Great, thanks so much for the question. So as I discussed, one of our key strategies has been focused on produce boxes. And I just want to anchor my response into a few key numbers. Approximately 76% of all our food boxes distributed through the city has been perishable: produce, meat, and dairy. All right. Another thing to understand is of produce, over 60% of our million boxes has been in produce. And understanding the fact that the need is in fresh fruits and vegetables. You know, when we look at our food environment, that is where the need is. And since that was so clearly defined, it was a natural conclusion to support regional produce growers, right? Because that's our greatest need. And we also need to support all our growers. And a lot of this is embedded in our sustainability plan under the Urban Ag and Food Systems chapter. So in implementation of that plan, it really guides us to look towards procurement contracts. What makes COVID really unique is that we needed a really resilient vendor contract. We couldn't rely on any one vendor because we never knew what was going to happen during COVID. So the typical process of what some cities may do is go for the one lowest vendor, you know, with the lowest contract point. That's not what we're doing in COVID. We wanted 3 vendors. We wanted backup systems upon backup systems, which allowed for us to have a really phenomenal response when it comes to produce. So to give you a few numbers that may be of interest, we have 3 vendors: Common Market, of course, Coastal, and Sunbelt. And of those 3 vendors, when you add all the numbers, we provided approximately 6.4 million pounds between March and May 2021 of regional and local produce. That's approximately $5.4 million that's going into the local regional economy for produce and vendors. Understanding our response is continuing, at least through September, and these numbers will go much higher because we're shifting more and more of our contracts right now to Common Market, and Common Market is going to continue to increase the amount of produce going into the summer months. So that's just one piece is on our produce vendor contracts. And because they were emergency contracts, we were able to move relatively quickly and target some of the language to be able to supply regionally and locally. But the second part I want to mention beyond produce contracts is going back to our strategy about building food resiliency through urban agriculture. So in addition to that, we allocated $82,000 to our Healthy Food Priority Area funds to urban agriculture. We also really wanted to support our growers, make sure in the day one when everything started to close up, that they had the paperwork they needed to be an essential worker and get to their jobs, right? And then when the vaccinations were rolling out, they were allowed to be some of the early people to get vaccinated. We want to make sure that they could get into that. So we supported them with vaccinations. So those are a few of the high levels of how we're supporting farmers. But a lot of this is embedded into our sustainability plan and our food systems chapter, and we were allowed to see that be implemented through our procurement contracts.
Amazing. Thanks, Holly. Speaks to the power of having that institutionalized in plans and in policy. So thank you. Kate, I know this was also really important to the city of New York. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I'll just share, I think, certainly appreciate and lift up everything that Holly mentioned, and there's some definite parallels. Similarly, actually in April of 2020, the mayor called for, because when everything, if you remember, everything was in short supply and you didn't know where anything was going to come from, all the stockpiles of masks and any kind of PPE. There was a deep fear of having some serious disruptions in the food supply chain. And because that was another sort of pillar of work that we were supporting, was to have a constant line of sight into any potential disruptions, we knew that that likely was not going to happen, but we still created a $50 million reserve. And again, as Holly mentioned, we're able to use emergency contracts in a way to actually prioritize some of the regional production in ways that, because we were in an emergency and we needed to rely on those short supply chains, that was certainly an opportunity that we took advantage of. That program that we transitioned once we saw that there wasn't a need for a reserve, we started distributing through our emergency food network that high quality, particularly fresh produce. And that is continuing to be funded into this current fiscal 22. We also, I just want to mention and really appreciate all of the farmers market networks across, well, the entire region, all of the country, but in particular New York to Grow NYC and to Harvest Home and many of the other community-based networks, but really just sort of helping them do what they do best, which is offer great markets. And so supporting them again in the early days with PPE, getting, social media and mayoral attention to say, go to your markets, they're safe, they're a great place, they're outdoors. And we supported them in a very similar way that we did with Common Market by having Grow NYC able to expand their fresh food box program in a no cost manner. And one thing I will say again, that has evolved at this point into a permanent regional food working group, but it started in the early days of we got what we called a tri-state call in partnership with our Department of City Planning. Again, if you remember these long haul truck drivers that, how do you cross state lines and bring things in? So we created actually rest stops in the city for those long haul truck drivers to be able to spend the night and take a break. And also that was really through thinking again about the transportation and food flows. So it's certainly about supporting farmers, but also in the case of the drivers of those trucks that were coming into the city to ensure a constant food supply. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm curious, Louisa, maybe if you wanted to add anything.
No, I mean, for us, it's really echoing what you guys have already said, especially Holly, in terms of it's about demand, right? It's not just some fun, trendy thing to do to have fresh produce. It's what people want. And as I said, our program is primarily powered and shaped by what community wanted and asked for. And that's what they were asking for, is fresh local produce. And so when we started doing that, we saw a huge reduction in food waste, which is a priority. And a large part that shaped who our contracts were. We also did emergency procurement, but it was that a priority of our office is to always work with Black and Brown owned businesses, and being able to do that through the local farmers network and through Common Market was just an incredible opportunity. And I think all this is, again, goes back to serving people with dignity. You want to give people dignified food. You want to give people food that they want to eat. Just because you're at need doesn't mean you should just eat what is available or something that is about to expire. You deserve fresh and local produce, and your family deserves that to be healthy. And so that also shaped what our contracts look like in terms of serving people in a dignified manner.
Thank you all. And I think that transitions beautifully into our next question, which is one that I'll pose to each of you in thinking about shifting to learnings. And as city agencies that are centered in food, policy, planning, community services, all of these issues that are at the nexus of so many social justice factors. When we talk about equity and we talk about dignity here, and in particular, we talk about equitable food systems, how do each of you define that within the context of your role? And from your perspectives, what responsibilities should cities hold both in and outside of crisis in supporting those goals?
I'm happy to start with that. And I just want to by way of answering it, in actually March, I'm sorry, about April of 2020, the mayor called for a task force on racial equity and inclusion, because clearly, COVID was impacting distinct communities in New York City, largely Black and Brown communities that were also at the center of so many other injustices, and namely racial injustice. That task force has now evolved into a commission on racial equity and inclusion, and is tasked with really looking at the actual city charter and proposing charter revisions to really ensure that the structural racism that exists throughout different forms in the city charter can be reversed. And that then is a way to really address equity, particularly racial equity, in every form of business that the city will continue to conduct. And I think, clearly the current structure of the food system, which often deepens racial disparities, is going to be impacted by that. I think that, we are certainly poised to be able to take advantage of some of those recommendations. We're looking very closely through the purchases, the procurements that we do. And I expect, particularly even into the next administration, that we'll continue to have a laser sharp focus on addressing racial equity in the city of New York.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, and to go on that, our team is part of the Office of Equity for the City of Atlanta, which also includes the Office of Sustainability, which I think is just a good model in terms of having these open conversations cross-departmental of what equity looks like and the different forms that equity can take. And as Kate was saying, just how structurally integrated inequity is. I think that this, for me particularly, the crisis highlighted how much the procurement process can lead to inequity because of the way that contracts are distributed and priorities that are given to the lowest quote versus potentially, is it Black or owned business, is it local? And so really taking as cities and taking responsibility to say we are going to prioritize equity. And that our responsibility is very high because we contain the power of the purse, the power of the money, the power of the spending and the visibility, which can take, local farmers to a different level. It can take pretty much any small entrepreneur to a different level. But unless you change the structural inequities, which exist already in cities, in procurement processes, in contracting, of how you distribute the money, you're never going to see that inequity fixed. And often we think of equity things when it's at the end user, right? Are we serving Black and Brown communities? And it shouldn't be that way. It's, are they collaborating? Are they participating in the process? Are they bidding on these contracts? Are we giving them viability to win these contracts? It has to be part of the entire process, and it's not an end user game. And so we are absolutely responsible as city agencies to ensure that this happens and use our money wisely, because it's not our money, right? It's the people's money and it needs to be used better.
To add to the theme here, so in Baltimore, in our sustainability plan, our goal is to be a city committed to building an equitable and resilient urban food system. So that is anchoring all the work we do. Another piece to understand in really engaging, thinking through equity, there is the government role of our interagency collaboration and the work that we're doing related to that, but there's also the engagement and resident component. So by the creation and formation of the resident food equity advisors, which they have been guiding and assisting us in our COVID-19 response, has been instrumental. Our Food Policy Action Coalition, which has grown significantly during the COVID-19 response. So it's not just about the engagement, but really trying to center our response to letting and participating with a resident-driven response, right? So that we can guide, and we've shifted our COVID-19 response along the way. For instance, as we started to see increased numbers of COVID in the Latinx community, our entire distribution and reorientation and working with immigrant affairs in Baltimore for our produce strategy went towards where that need is. So those are some of the key pieces. I want to lift up one thing that Louisa was saying about procurement contracts. What we heard really early on was that the community organizations needed the city to pay for the food, right? That they could hand out the food, they could volunteer their time, they could stand up, and they've done an amazing work, but they needed the city to pay for it. And so when I look at equity in this context, I look at it in our ability as a role of our city, is that that's what we needed to do. So we were able to use our FEMA reimbursement, and approximately $26 million is in FEMA reimbursement to pay for our full produce response and food box response that is allowing for these produce contracts with Common Market and all the farmers, and to really look at it as a mitigation strategy to reduce COVID-19 transmission.
Thank you all so much for that. Continuing on to think about our learnings here, Holly, we know that the city of Baltimore recently released a 40-page strategy on how to improve nutritional security during COVID-19 that detailed your efforts and how you executed on all of this. And of course, everyone should give it a read, which is now in the chat as well. What were some of your biggest learnings? And if we were to face a similar crisis moving forward, what are some of the most pivotal strategies that you all would consider for implementation moving forward?
Great. So I would say first and foremost, some of the key learnings is governance is really important. And one of the things to note is, as a food policy director, I've worked very closely with Kate along the way, the entire COVID-19 response, with all the other food policy directors and advisors, the United States Conference of Mayors, and we were meeting regularly. And so one of the learnings that I had was really looking at how our emergency operation plan is specifically on food. Like, we need it specific on food, not an attachment, not an appendix, not a part of mass and shelter and care, but food in its own right needs its own logistics, operations, and leadership. And so we learned from New York, we learned from San Francisco, we've been learning from other cities. And so as a result, we are rewriting our emergency operation plan for a specific function in food insecurity with an org chart. So that is one thing that we have learned. We were able to stand up because we already were all here. And I think that the second part is understanding the role of government in times of crisis, is that when that crisis hits, every single person and every single agency is going to be under stress, and people can't take on new things. So we already had the infrastructure and support of food systems. I had a team of food systems planner, food resilience planner, food access planner, and then many other people in city government who already have been working in this area. And I think that for other cities and other jurisdictions, understanding that food needs to be staffed. It can't just be reliant on the nonprofit sector, but we need to have institutional knowledge inside our city government or local jurisdictions. And then I think one of sort of a programmatic stance, I think that in Baltimore, we broke the myth, right? We broke the myth. And sometimes you hear, oh, you know, we can't do mass distribution of produce, right? It has high shrink. It's going to go to waste. People may not want it. You have to do it in large quantities, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And we have moved 18,000 produce boxes over 100 community organizations per week during the pandemic. And guess what? It's all, you know, all the sites need it, and we're not seeing much shrink. And the way that we're looking at food assistance in the future is saying produce works. We can do it at scale in small distributions with community organizations. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. And yeah, we have certainly seen that in our response and partnership with you. It's been an amazing network of diverse partners that you all have lifted up to facilitate these distributions. So thank you for sharing all that. Kate or Louisa, any big learnings that would guide your future city responses that you'd like to reflect on?
Sure. We also put forward, we could have delayed it, but I think there were so many incredible lessons in seizing the moment and the energy around food to release the city's first 10-year food policy plan, Food Forward, nyc.gov/food forward. And that outlines, I think, more than 75 different strategies across different sectors that we would want to see implemented to get to a much more resilient and equitable food system. But in particular, I want to call out something that we are on the heels of launching, piloting, I should really underscore, in the next few weeks, which is, if it were in place before COVID, we would have been able to respond in a much different way, which is making sure that our local network of grocers and retailers, which in this city is very independent and full of small grocers, but if those grocers could, for the entire spectrum of people experiencing food insecurity, not just people that can use their credit cards and accept deliveries at all, at their door and at all hours, but for people who are on SNAP, or for people that need additional income assistance to pay for their groceries to be delivered, and support the really good delivery services and require that. Those are the kinds of things that, we can be supporting our own infrastructure, our own local system, so that we can be in a much better position. I don't think anyone would ever have imagined that everyone would be desiring and craving to have their meals and their food and their groceries delivered to them. But that is a resource that we also need to lean into, to be able to make sure that that can occur for people who work very sporadic hours and across different income levels. We know in this city that only of the people who are food insecure, about 25% of them are utilizing the classic pantry system. That leaves 75% who have to use their existing retail network. And we need to be able to come up with innovative ideas and programs to be able to support people with what they want, when they need it, in the same way that other people who are not income compromised have access to.
Great, thank you, Kate.
Yeah, and I think, not to add too much more to that, but just the importance for us, not just of being part of the communities that you're serving and already having those relationships of trust, so you already know where your needs are, who you need to reach out to, but also knowing your local food ecosystems, as Holly and Kate said, like knowing where everybody is and everybody being ready to act in a time of crisis is critical. And I would say for us in Atlanta, we saw gaps that needed to be filled. And now for us moving forward, it's, well, how do we invest long-term to fill those gaps of capacity so that our local food ecosystem can serve diverse communities, and the need for that long-term investment.
Great. Thank you all so much. I mean, such a beautiful list of learnings, and certainly excited to see how this positions us for more resiliency going into the future. So thank you all for that. I now want to shift to moving forward and how we think about the future. And we're seeing that right now, food policy councils and city leaders across the country are engaging and strategizing about how American Rescue Plan resources might flow into their communities. So Louisa, I'm going to point this to you because we know that the city of Atlanta in particular has plans and budgets reserved to address food insecurity using ARPA funding. How have you seen this playing out? And do you have any strategies or recommendations for other city leaders who are looking to deploy those funds towards similar food access or food system issues?
Yeah, and I think I'm not speaking for myself when I would say all cities learned a lot from CARES Act spending. But the great thing in comparing CARES Act versus American Rescue Plan is that it allows for more flexibility, and it allows, as I was mentioning before, the need for more long-term capacity building investment. And that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the American Rescue Plan. So I mentioned before, as the Office of Immigrant Affairs, food security is not really our niche. We have no idea what we're doing. So we're very grateful for this amazing network we have and our Office of Sustainability here internally as well. But what we did see is what we can help fill, and what we need to use money to help fill, is the capacity of our local organizations to help them build out their ability to serve, and that the American Rescue Plan can be used to do that. It can be used to create resilience. It can be used to create backup systems so that when another crisis occurs, we are more able and ready to serve, not just alone as a city, but with all of our partners. And for us, this means working with our local organizations to make sure, hey, here are the local pockets of immigrant communities. This is how you can serve them. This is how to create language access plans. This is how you can use American Rescue Plan funding to increase your staff capacity to serve limited English proficient individuals. This is how you can look at different food culture and incorporate that into your planning for farming and all of that of, can you grow more cilantro? Because there is still a need in Atlanta, and we might not think it, for cilantro in these communities. And so really taking this American Rescue Plan funding and looking at how do you build long-term capacity? How are you going to be ready for your next shock to your system by investing in these emergency plans in a long-term sustainable way? And that's what I recommend. That I think all cities are really trying to look at that right now.
Great. Thank you, Louisa. Kate, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a few things. Number one, for actually close to 30 years, New York has been using its city tax base to provide food to our emergency food providers. So it's basically a local version of TFAP if you're in the acronyms there, if that's the federal government program. So the city's emergency food assistance program will see a boost, and that is again directly connected to something that we were able to design this year, which is to ensure that we are directing new food resources to the areas that need it most. And so it's not just using the same algorithms and systems that have existed for years, but really looking at need, whether it's food insecurity and increases and decreases in food insecurity, but also some other things, certainly like unemployment, and also really the flows of emergency food. We're a big city with a lot of actors moving fresh produce and shelf stable goods. And we're all now aligned and actually putting in where we expect to distribute emergency food. And also, if we see sudden needs, we can be able to respond to them in ways that in March of 2020, we can't. So that system that will continue to be supported is made possible through the recovery funds. Also, the continuation to prevent, I think, again, this is unfortunately all too common in times of crisis, but we have a cliff effect now of these massive influxes of emergency food into the system, and how do we start to taper that off in ways that don't leave anyone in a lurch, but also can plan for that in a respectful way. So we're going to continue that PFRED program that I mentioned, that's particularly pointed towards fresh produce. I mentioned, we'll have a lot more to say about this in the fall, but we're going to be piloting a program designed to provide credit for online delivery of groceries, again, in cultures and ethnically appropriate ways. And then again, it's finally going to support good food purchasing, being able to support our infrastructure in the city to align all 9 city agencies that buy food, more than $500 million a year, and really get the nuts and bolts in place. We're going to be releasing our plans, our baseline, our city records around all of that later this month. And so we are going to be building that infrastructure that Holly talked about investing in city staff and city resources to be able to keep the best of what came from this crisis going.
Great, so I'm going to follow up with Kate. So looking at where we are right now, we have approximately 200,000 people that are currently on SNAP food stamps. It went from 1 in 4 residents before COVID to 1 in 3 right now. During COVID, we were able to get online SNAP implemented. However, the numbers are really low, and there's a lot of ways that we need to make this system be equitable and work. So for people who cannot get near a grocery store, they should have the same rights and abilities to get food directly ordered to their house conveniently and affordably. So one of the things that we're looking at with ARPA is really how do we make online SNAP really work for the city of Baltimore and for the residents and the food retailers. Kate, I will definitely be following up with you afterwards related to the credits. We too are looking at ways to make this work. We have the beginning, the policy is strong, but the rollout and implementation, we need to work really hard and use supports in ARPA to make this work. Another piece I want to note is there's all these great ideas that we have, in Baltimore and other cities on how we're going to use ARPA. But the reality is COVID numbers are going up right now, right? And so for Baltimore, we are right now, FEMA is 100% reimbursement. So all our funds are getting reimbursed for our produce box distribution, but that changes in the fall. And FEMA reimbursement goes down to 75%. So if cities are going to continue with their operations, we're going to need funds. So now we're really starting to recalculate as of really this morning, as our numbers keep changing, that we need to reserve ARPA funds for direct COVID-19 response, which is really, we have to do it. But it means that it's harder to plan for the future when we're directly needing to respond to the immediate crisis. And I think that is a struggle that all of us face, is how do we plan for a future when we're still at huge scale of operations and logistics to address food insecurity right now in COVID. And so I hope ARPA will help shape the future of what food systems will look like. But right now we also need to balance that with direct need during COVID-19.
Thank you for lifting that up, Holly. Yeah, it's certainly, as we're entering into the fall here, this balance of emergency and future thinking and the reality that cases are still rising, and how do we plan for that? So those are all the questions that I had. Thank you all so much. I do want to spend the next 7 minutes that we have answering some questions that have come through the Q&A. And so first, it looks like there's some questions about this balance, like what we've just been talking about. So this balance of how can these emergency programs actually contribute to long-term resiliency in food systems? And it's clear that these emergency programs met really important demand, but how does that get to continue in a post-crisis world? And how do we balance this view of emergency to long-term systems planning?
I will start, and others can certainly grab onto it. I mentioned this, New York and the country has been operating an emergency food system for the same way for 30 years. And I really look forward to, and frankly, all of the federal safety net programs have not really seen a radical sort of transformation. And I think that with things like pandemic EBT, with things like, using USDA foods to really lean in more to support regional growers rather than really, really large scale growers. I think those are on-ramps onto some pretty transformational systems change. But again, I think that, I'll just use that statistic I already gave. If you consider the whole spectrum of food insecurity, the people that use the classic pantry system should be able to continue to use that. But at least in this city, we're not reaching 3/4 of food insecure people, if that's all we're talking about. And so the more and more we can do to support, again, it all gets back to income, and it gets back to livelihoods and sufficiency. So if we can start to really look at the spectrum of offerings to make sure, food insecurity is rooted in income insecurity and cultural appropriateness. So I'd like to see, as we, again, Holly, it's like that subtle dance of yes, we're still in emergency, but we are also moving towards recovery and squarely in that as well, but how we can be doing that to not just be in this crisis moment for much longer.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, and I think all I would add to that in terms of how to look at emergency situations overall is to really work and collaborate with the communities that you are serving, the vulnerable communities or the individuals that you're seeking to serve, because having that investment by them into the programs, having that collaboration with them will ensure that programs are successful. And this is including in times of emergency when people are facing a lot of different things. You want to have this trust, you want to have this community ground set that they already know who to communicate, who to talk to, who to reach out to in a case of emergency is critical. So really just working very closely with communities that might be impacted by any crisis.
Thank you. I'll move on to another question here. I know we were talking a lot about contracts and what the emergency contracts allowed in terms of flexibility and not necessarily having to go for the lowest bidder because of the moment of crisis. And there's a question here about an appetite to continue some of this in non-emergency times. Kate, I know you already spoke a bit to the Good Food Purchasing Program, but wondering if, speaking a little bit about contracts.
I want to be clear that we still had a low bid requirement. That what was the emergency contracting means the time to get from issuing a need to registering a contract is incredibly abbreviated. And again, because we're in an emergency, I think that one of the ways that I described this was also being able to identify why we might need more regional foods in a time of emergency. And that provided an opening that I don't think has closed, but I know that, you know, this could be a 3-hour session just on the fine details of procurement. And I won't go there, but, you know, our emergency procurements end October 30th. And so that presents a whole other opportunity for continued work and contracting.
Yeah, I think procurement questions are difficult to answer because each city has its own procurement craziness, as I like to call it. It's so complex. But I would say as a whole, there is an appetite to review procurement policies, as I said, to look at it from an equity lens, and a conversation, particularly in Atlanta, of like, how do we ensure that procurement policies aren't becoming a barrier to serving diverse communities or contracting with diverse communities. And so, I mean, is there an appetite? I think there absolutely can be. And there's always an appetite if more constituents ask. So as everyone who is on this call lives somewhere and is the resident of somewhere, you should always ask and push your elected officials in that way.
Wonderful. Well, as we come up to 1 minute before the hour, I just want to thank you all so much for your time today and for sharing all of the tremendous work that went into these emergency efforts over the past 1.5 years. You all have certainly inspired me, and I'm sure our attendees as well. I will leave with just a quick note about Common Market and our work. We serve communities throughout the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Texas, and very soon to be Chicagoland, by providing access to fresh, healthy foods from small to mid-scale family farmers and producers. We're so honored to have facilitated this conversation today and very excited to collaborate with any of you that are interested in introducing fresh, regionally sourced foods into your food access or citywide programming. So don't hesitate to reach out. Our website and my email will be put in the chat. And Rachel, I'll pass it to you if you have any final remarks, but thank you all so much for this discussion.
I'll keep it brief and just say thank you, Rachel, Louisa, Holly, and Kate for such an engaging conversation. I learned a ton, and I imagine that most of the participants did too. So it was a pleasure talking to you all and looking forward to keeping in touch. And we will go ahead and end the webinar now.